Our third presentation is Nina Jankowicz, and the title of her capstone is Poland, Russia, and the Eastern Partnership, Economically Productive, Politically Unstable.
Thank you, Dr. Stunt. Thank you all for being here. According to Moscow State University, 42.8% of Russians feel that Poland has an adversarial relationship with Russia, and the only countries perceived as less friendly are Ukraine and the United States. Last summer, when I was in Poland and Russia discussing the current state of Polish-Russian relations with professors and friends, for the most part, they said the relations were stable. However, both Russians and Poles cited Poland's aggressive Eastern foreign policy as one of the largest remaining roadblocks between the two countries. So for this project, I decided to look into Poland's Eastern policy, particularly as exemplified through the Eastern Partnership Initiative, and its effect on Polish-Russian relations. In my paper, I attempt to ascertain whether productive Polish-Russian relations are possible if Poland continues its aggressive pursuit of the Eastern Partnership's goals. Through an explanation of the Eastern Partnership's establishment and the Russian reaction to it, and a comparison of Polish assistance activities in Belarus and Ukraine, I conclude that while economic Eastern Partnership programming does not seem to affect Polish-Russian relations, political programming aimed at democratization and strengthening EU ties is a cause for great instability. And before I begin, it's important to note that for the purposes of my research, I understand Poland as the main driver of EU's Eastern policy, and as such, any attacks by Russia on the EU's policy are interpreted as attacks on Poland. So the Eastern Partnership was established in 2009 by Poland and Sweden, and I see this as a direct result of the Russia-Georgia War of 2008. The EU saw this as a signal that its Eastern Neighborhood policy, the predecessor of the EAP, needed to be strengthened, particularly in regard to the former Soviet states. The Visegrad Four even said that the ENP, the Eastern Neighborhood Policy, lacked teeth, that it didn't provide enough incentives for partner countries to reform, being as it didn't have any association agreements or deep and comprehensive free trade agreements attached to it. And also they felt that it wasn't focused enough geographically and didn't pay enough attention to their region, the post-Soviet region. And for that reason, the Eastern Partnership focuses only on 6 countries: Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. And according to its charter, its objectives are to create a more ambitious partnership between the EU and partner countries, and to create the necessary conditions to accelerate political association and further economic integration. So from the charter, it's immediately evident that association and eventually accession is the goal of the Eastern Partnership. The partnership functions through a 2-track approach. Bilateral and multilateral tracks. The bilateral track is a bilateral relationship between the EU and each individual partner country, which focuses on the signing of association agreements and deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. The multilateral track is kind of a group effort of all 6 partner countries and the EU working on combating shared issues. So they do this through conferences and shared pools of funding. Poland's impetus in creating the Eastern Partnership I see as multifaceted. Of course, it has economic and security interests in the region, but also Poland's own transition experiences make it an ideal teacher for the transition to democracy. I feel that it wants to carve out its own space in the EU as a leader in Eastern policy and transition politics. In addition, many have postured that Poland is trying to infringe on Russia's sphere of influence, the post-Soviet sphere of influence. However, Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski has said otherwise, and he sees the Eastern Partnership as a way, instead of boxing Russia out, to bring Russia in. He feels that if the Eastern partners reform enough, that Russia too will be encouraged to reform and adopt a more pro-European stance. However, as you can imagine, Russia had a very negative reaction to the establishment of the Eastern Partnership. Sergei Markov, a Duma deputy, even said that this initiative has had an anti-Russian character from the very beginning, while Medvedev said that it is a partnership structured against Russia. These criticisms were so strong at the beginning that Eastern Partnership leadership even changed the program's charter to downplay enlargement connotations and assuage Russia's fears. Which brings me to my case studies. I chose to look at Belarus and Ukraine for several reasons. First of all, Belarus and Ukraine were the 2 most contested members of the Eastern Partnership to be included, for different reasons. Belarus, of course, because of its poor human rights and reform record, and Ukraine because of its somewhat ambiguous relationship with Russia. Russia is obviously extremely worried about losing Ukraine to Western influence. And thirdly, both are critical to Poland's foreign policy goals. One journalist even remarked that Poland cannot truly be free without a free Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. So in Belarus, by the time the Eastern Neighborhood policy was created, Belarus's human rights and reform record was so poor that it wasn't even offered an action plan. However, this changed after the 2006 elections. And at this time in Belarus, things were economically very stable thanks to gas and oil subsidies that Belarus had been receiving from Russia, which were promptly cut off after the 2006 elections, which caused a huge economic downturn in the country. And the EU saw this as its chance to really reorient Belarus's policies and jump in as a partner for Belarus. In exchange for reform, the EU offered funding, foreign direct investment, and increase in tourism, in exchange especially for political and civil society reforms. And after this agreement, all of these things increased rapidly, Belarus's situation improved, and one could say that it had a complete turnaround in its foreign policy vector. But despite this move in the right direction, or toward the European direction, its Eastern Partnership inclusion was still debatable. Many countries were against including it because of its previous human rights record, and so it was decided that Belarus would only participate in the multilateral track of the program, which barred it from ever signing an association agreement or a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. Even so, Belarus wasn't clear on the fact that by participating in the multilateral track, it was obliged to participate in all of the multilateral programming, including civil society and democratization programming, and because of this almost left the partnership. And as it stands right now, Belarus only participates in economic programming. The Russian reaction in the first 2 years of the Eastern Partnership to Belarusian inclusion was not very accepting, and in fact, the Russians claimed that the EU had bartered Lukashenko's non-recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia after the Georgia War for inclusion, and that really there was just all of this political bartering going on, that Belarus really didn't want to be included but just wanted the money for reform. However, after the 2010 elections, this changed as Belarus again reoriented its foreign policy. I'm not going to go into detail describing those events, as I'm sure we all know what happened, but we can decisively state that this was again a turn back toward Russia. This didn't change Poland's policies toward Belarus, and in fact, in the year after the 2010 elections, Poland doubled the amount of funding allotted to democracy and civil society programming, and it amounts to $13.2 million US, which, although it doesn't seem like a ton to us, is the largest amount that any non-Scandinavian EU member invests in Belarus, and it is the second highest recipient of Polish aid, second only to Afghanistan. This money also supports independent media, scholarships for persecuted students who can't get a spot at university in Belarus to study in Poland. However, it's a little bit difficult to find information about Poland's support for opposition parties, progressive labor unions, and other organizations that have a political bent to them, and this is obviously to protect these people. Unfortunately, in 2012, this sort of information ended up online somehow. It's still unclear who leaked this information from the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, but it was very detailed and included the amounts of money being funneled to opposition parties and the actual individuals who were receiving the money. Of course, Belarus did not react too kindly to this and even called these actions subversive, even though Poland is very somewhat open about the fact that it is investing in the democratization of Belarus. And the diplomatic situation was extremely tense between the two nations for a while. However, interestingly, Russia really did not have a reaction, as far as I read, to the situation at all. It didn't even address it. And to me, this says that Russia is confident that Belarus can handle this type of situation on its own. Since Belarus only participates in economic programming and is very obviously politically aligned with Russia, its involvement in the Eastern Partnership does not bother Russia or irritate Polish-Russian relations, at least in comparison to Ukraine. Ukraine has always had an ambiguous foreign policy since its independence and never really chose a foreign policy vector. However, Ukraine has always been a foreign policy priority for Poland. Early on, since Ukrainian independence, the two established economic and political cooperation, and this was only affirmed during the 2004 elections. Poland had just become an EU member, and after the electoral fraud and multiple rounds of elections in Ukraine, Poland led the push for EU intervention, even though the EU was extremely reluctant to intervene in the situation. Presidents Kwasniewski, Adamkus, and EU Representative Javier Solana acted as mediators in ending the electoral deadlock, and many say that without Kwasniewski's adamance that the EU be involved, the Orange Revolution as we know it would not have even occurred. And Russia, of course, considered the results of the 2004 elections as a defeat and saw Poland as the main perpetrator behind this defeat. However, since the Orange Revolution, Poland's priority for Ukraine has been EU accession and continues today to be EU accession. And it was widely believed after the Orange Revolution that Ukraine would achieve accession within a few years. Unfortunately, we know this not to be the case. Some might say that this is because of the weakness or lack of EU funding toward the Eastern Partnership. Poland itself invests $3 to $5 million per year, mostly focused on democratization, civil society bolstering efforts, rule of law, economic harmonization. But unfortunately, it hasn't quite pushed Ukraine enough toward the direction of accession. And as we know, Ukraine has experienced a lot of backsliding on human rights in its elections, and also still has not chosen a foreign policy vector. Not to mention the biggest stick in the mud right now is Yulia Tymoshenko's still sitting in prison, and the EU is unwilling to, rightly so, compromise its morals in order to achieve its goal of Ukrainian EU accession. So instead of being a poster child for the Eastern Partnership, Ukraine has become a liability for the program in many respects. And I would say that this is due in large part to the fact that Russia continues to put pressure on EU to join the customs union with Belarus and Kazakhstan, and especially lately has been talking about this pie-in-the-sky Eurasian Union that Putin wants to achieve someday. And though they never directly attack each other, I think Russia and Poland are engaged in a foreign policy war of sorts over Ukraine. This is illustrated by Sikorski's recent address to the Sejm, in which he referred to Russia as a country with a different civilizational model than the EU, which is inconsistent when it comes to modernizing its institutions and society, and is taking a step back on the path toward democracy. And although Poland would likely never outright condemn Russia, I think this is as close as we will get in a diplomatic situation. Poland is still hoping that Ukraine will sign an association agreement at the Vilnius summit this fall, and I actually just read a tweet from Foreign Minister Sikorski this afternoon urging Ukraine to make the necessary reforms in the next 3 months so that this can be achieved. So, given our case studies, it's important to come back to the research question of whether or not productive Polish-Russian relations are possible, given Poland's continued pursuit and aggressive pursuit of the Eastern Partnership's goals. With Belarus, which only participates in multilateral economic programming and is quick to distance itself from Poland's subversive democracy programming, Belarus has completely disappeared from Russia's complaints about the Eastern Partnership. Ukraine, on the other hand, which has not chosen its foreign policy vector and dabbles with both the ideas of European and Eurasian trajectories, receives a good deal of political financing from Poland and thus plenty of criticism from Russia, which hopes to retain Ukraine in its sphere of influence. I feel that 2013 could bring about another surge in Eastern Partnership-inspired ire, particularly as Ukraine and Poland's particularly as regards to Ukraine and Poland's plans for its EU accession. And from what I've seen in my research, the EU's economic programming allows Poland and Russia a chance to retain some stability in their relations, while political programming encourages the age-old battle of spheres of influence. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will take any questions you have.
Thank you. I should tell you, I was in a meeting this morning with Chancellor Merkel's National Security Advisor, and he didn't sound too optimistic about Ukraine's chances of this having this accession agreement, but you know, he also said the Poles are pushing for it.
Yes, they are.
You know, it reminded me, way back in the 90s, there was a program called PAUCI, P-A-U-C-I, where the United States encouraged Poland to work with Ukraine to say, we're the example of, you know, how you can move towards democracy and markets and everything else. So I guess this is a
Long road.
a very long road. Questions, comments?
I really enjoyed your talk, Nina. I have a question. I just wanted to know if you looked at all at energy politics in your paper, because, as you know, I focus on Moldova, which is another Eastern Partnership country, probably arguably that's closest to being integrated. And I've noticed that Russia really uses that against the country. Like, Gazprom charges them more than anyone else, and when Moldova is making moves towards further integration into Europe in some areas, they'll raise the prices or threaten to raise prices or talk about the Transnistrian gas debt. So is that something that comes into play with Belarus and Ukraine, and can you talk about it a little?
Yeah, absolutely. I do touch on it in the paper. I just didn't have too much time to go into detail, but it was used against both countries when they made their kind of turns toward Europe, both after the 2006 elections in Belarus and after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2005. There was actually a gas cutoff from Russia, and of course. This is extremely important to Poland because all of the gas pipelines and oil pipelines go through either Belarus or Ukraine into Poland, and that's, like, I think, one of the main inspirations behind trying to get these countries under the European umbrella so that these energy crises won't have a larger effect on the European community.
I have a question. I don't know if you really covered this, but I was just kind of curious. Does Poland attempt to do any sort of, like, through the Eastern Partnership, like, I guess, like, cultural exchanges or sort of like non-political methods of sort of drawing Ukraine and Belarus into Europe? Like, I was thinking just specifically of, like, the recent European football championships, which were co-hosted in, you know, Poland and Ukraine. Is that something that the Eastern Partnership tries to do?
Yes, that's part of the multilateral track of the program. There's a lot of people-to-people exchanges. Although, given my experience, I don't really think that that's where the most work needs to be done. Poland and Ukraine, although they do have moments of misunderstanding, particularly as related to the interwar period, they tend to get along very well and find a lot of common ground, as do, surprisingly, at least with my interviews this past summer, Russians and Poles are starting to understand each other more on a people-to-people basis as well. I think the disagreements are at the political level. So while there are cultural exchanges and these people-to-people partnerships, I think Poland really directs its money mostly toward the political vector because they see that as the most important.
Does Poland in any way come out, are they developing these institutionally relationships in the political vector, or are they actually coming out and saying, like, Jankowicz is not, like, a good guy, or we're more pro Timoshenko? Have they said anything of that sort, or at least that would clearly indicate that they are on the opposition side that would make the relationship more difficult?
Well, they're certainly in favor of releasing Timoshenko from prison, although they haven't outright condemned the Jankowicz regime. I think it's evident in the decreasing amount of funding that Ukraine is receiving that there's less approval of what's going on there. And the partnership actually does operate on the more for more principle, so more reforms, more money. And as Ukraine has kind of pulled back from its European vector, they've been getting less and less, so I think that's a condemnation of sorts. In terms of institutionally, that would be part of the multilateral vector, so it's not only Poland that is creating those institutional ties, but creating institutional ties among the 6 partner countries as well as other Eastern EU states. Lithuania is actually also very active, and that's why 2013 is a big year for Eastern Partnership because they will be assuming the EU presidency in July, actually. So.
Just a small follow-up. Is there any evidence of increased activity maybe in Western Ukraine, where they're more maybe open to that kind of relationship, or Eastern Ukraine?
It's really hard to get the data on where the money is going for obvious reasons, like I said. So I think in general, most of the relationship with the Eastern Partnership is on a government-to-government basis, and some of the funding under the EAP, particularly Polish funding, goes through civil society groups. I imagine most of those are in Eastern Ukraine, Western Ukraine rather, sorry.
Yeah.
Just curious about, I wonder if you could talk a little about like the level of like the funding, Polish funding to Ukraine, and I guess, because you talked about such, for at least Poland, a high level of money going into Belarus, and yet they have, Belarus's human rights concerns are so much worse. Like, how does it stack up with Ukraine? Because you talk about the lowering of the funds and the fear of the human rights violations or like political repression in Ukraine. I was just curious how those two stack up. It seems like they're mutually, like, they're doing one thing in Belarus and completely different in.
I agree. I think part of that is because the activities that they support in Belarus require a little bit more of startup costs. A lot of those are actual grants going to students to bring them to Poland. They're also supporting independent media, which I imagine has a higher cost than just giving grants to civil society groups to help them function on a day-to-day basis. I can't really answer why there's this double standard for Ukraine and Belarus. To be honest, the United States does the same thing. We've got a lot of money going there too. And you'd think that it's kind of tacit support for the Lukashenko regime, but without it, we can't ever hope to have them make that turn. So it's just, they've got to bite the bullet in that instance, I guess.
You said that Ukraine hasn't really defined its foreign policy direction very clearly. I mean, it's technically a non-bloc country, right, which is kind of strange in the post-war, Cold War world because we don't have blocs anymore. But that's what, if you read its foreign policy concept, its constitution, it says it's a non-bloc country, whatever that means.
And I've read a couple of things recently that call Ukraine a stagnarchy, that it's fine getting money from both the Russians and the Poles, and because of that we'll just sit in stagnation for the rest of its being.
Stagnarchy is that's a good term. Maybe one more question. So obviously one of the real concerns that Poland has is it doesn't want to always be the easternmost border of stability in Europe, right? So this is one of the points of this Eastern Partnership, because if you can get Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus at least, I'm not talking about the South Caucasus now, but even those three countries, or at least two of them, with association agreements and everything, then somehow Poland itself feels less vulnerable. Do you believe that's still a concern now, or as much of a concern as it was when they, started the neighborhood policy at least?
I do think so. Not only because of the great cost that Poland incurs defending those borders, well, not defending those borders, but keeping those borders secure, but because in 2008, Poland, whether this was a Kaczynski administration policy or not, Poland felt threatened by the Georgia War. Kaczynski even said, today Georgia, tomorrow Estonia, and the next day Poland, or something like that. So I think that Poland really is threatened by Russia's geopolitical stance and the fact that it manifests itself so often in the former post-Soviet neighborhood.
Other questions, comments? Well, thank you.